Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ann Park. I work with University of Toronto School of Continuing Studies Blueprint Career Services, and I am extremely pleased to be welcoming all of you to our Blueprint panel discussion, Real Talk, Navigating Disability in the Workplace. So I'm just going to do a brief access check right now. I just want to make sure if everyone can hear me. Can you see the presentation clearly? Are there any other access needs that might affect your participation? Now, I will be sharing this. I was planning to share this with all of you in the next slide or so, but this session is being recorded and will be available on our Blueprint Career Services portal shortly after this wonderful panel. So that might affect your ability to access this panel. But is there anything that anyone wants to share in the Q&A with regards to accessibility challenges? I don't see anything. If you do want to make a note of that in our Q&A in our chat box, please do, and we'll work on that. So go to the next slide, please. Great. So first I'd like to start out with a land acknowledgement. I would like to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. And I just want to acknowledge my how I have benefited as a settler from the colonization of the original indigenous peoples of this land. And acknowledge also that land acknowledgements are extremely important as we move forward in all of the work that we do here at Blueprint Career Services. Great. So we're just going to share a few housekeeping items. Just as a reminder, first of all, please remember to keep your cameras and mics off during the presentation, with the exception of the panelists, of course. Post questions and comments in the chat. Questions will be responded to at the end of the moderated question portion. Please complete our very brief survey at the end of the presentation. And as I mentioned before, this session is being recorded and will be posted on our Blueprint Career Services portal. So before we begin with why you're here, which is here to hear from our amazing panelists, I just want to speak briefly about what we do here at Blueprint Career Services. So you're here for our wonderful Real Talk panel, but we also have Industry Insights panel, which are offered every other month. So next month we have an Industry Insights panel, and the career path that we chose to focus on the industry specifically is the financial sector. So please do check it out. Now that you're registered onto the Blueprint Career Services portal, you will be informed of upcoming panels, so that way you can jump on board and register for these exciting events as soon as possible. Another offering that we have is the wonderful Clifton Strengths Workshop. It involves an assessment which identifies your top 5 strengths, and then a workshop to discuss how to utilize those top 5 strengths and how they can really elevate your career, followed up by a one-on-one coaching session with me to discuss how you can further elevate those your identified strengths in network while you network and as you're working and in job interviews. We also have something called the Career Wayfinding Series workshops. This is a 3-part series. They're 3 hours each. This is based loosely on something called Design Your Life, and which is out of Stanford University, in which we discuss a specific methodical way of planning your careers. So instead of being at the mercy of these employers by just sending out resumes, cover letters, this approach is very step by step and really can help you feel in charge and empowered by the whole job search, any kind of job search efforts and career transition efforts you're making. And last but not least, we have our wonderful Career Nav sessions, which are one-on-one sessions with me again. And in these sessions, they're an hour in length, and you can get support from me to discuss some of the challenges that you've had in navigating your career and how to transition successfully to various careers through wonderful exercises and tools and tips and support. So that's what we're all about. And of course, for more information, please do contact us. I can be reached directly at scs.blueprint@utoronto.ca. Great. Okay. So now for the main event, I would like to invite to welcome our wonderful panelists who are here today. And first, we're going to start with Ben Poynton. So, Ben, if you can please introduce yourself to everyone, that would be wonderful.
Thank you very much, Anne. Good morning. Well, sorry, good afternoon, everybody. Really delighted to be on this panel. So I'm Ben. I work at the University of Toronto as the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act officer. A bit about me, I use he, him pronouns, identify as cisgender. I'm a white settler to this land, having moved here quite freely from the UK in 2009. And I do have a history of personal lived experience with mental health related disabilities. To describe myself for the benefit of those who can't see at the moment for whatever reason, I'm a white-skinned middle-aged man with a dark beard. I have a blue shirt has stars on it, and in my background I have a heart that I'm hoping will inspire many of you today. Quickly about my background. My academic background is in international human rights, and there's a question related to this, but quickly, I'm particularly interested in how inclusive policy making and remaking can be one tool to bring about justice and truth telling. I'm really excited to engage with you all today on the panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. We're really excited for you to be on our panel too. I really appreciate that wonderful introduction. Next, I'd like to welcome Chloe G.K. Atkins, PhD, to our panel. Chloe, would you mind introducing yourself to everyone, please?
Hi there, my name's Chloe, and I'm currently in the Department of Political Science at the University of Toronto Scarborough. I'm a status-only member there. My primary appointment's at the University of Calgary, where I'm on disability leave. But currently, I'm the director of a research institute called the Proud Project, which does work around disability and anti-ableism, and in particular around disability and employment. We've just finished a multi-year study and a multi-country study of talking to people with disabilities who have careers, as well as talking to employers who hire them. I myself have a disability. It's episodic, which is why I became quite interested in this topic. Is I at times am quite disabled or apparently disabled, and other times I can pass. When I can pass, my job experience is very different from when I cannot pass, and so I became quite aware of the barriers that people who cannot mask their disabilities have in the workplace. In terms of those who have visual impairments, I am white. I have short, dark, graying hair. I'm a middle-aged woman. I'm wearing a green jacket and a pink scarf, and I have blue eyes. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Chloe. We're so excited that you're here as well. Maggie, I'd like you to please introduce yourself. This is Maggie Dowling, please.
Hello, everyone. So thank you for having me and for coming in today. Together with my colleague Kim, I run the WIN program at Woodgreen. So WIN is a small employment program for people with mental health issues. I've been in this role for about 13 years now, and have participated in the whole process from creating the content of our workshops to working individually and in groups with job seekers with mental health disabilities. So I'm very excited to be here. Thanks.
Thanks, Maggie. I appreciate it, and we're very excited to have you as well. And last but not least, by the way, this is alphabetical by first name. Mahadio Sukai. We'd appreciate if you could please introduce yourself to everyone.
Sukai, and
Thank you for correcting me, Sukai.
It's all right. So hi everybody. My name is Dr. Mahadio Sukai. I am the Vice President Research and International Affairs and the Chief Accessibility Officer for the Canadian National Institute for the Blind, or CNIB. I have status-only appointments at Queen's University, Ontario Tech University, and OCAD University in various departments. I am a settler to the land, also having come here of my free will some 3 decades ago and a little bit more. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a cancer geneticist by training. That's what my PhD is in. I now work in what I would call public health and um, public health and social determinants of health research. It is health and medical research, but it's also social research, understanding the quality of life and lived experience of persons who are blind, deafblind, low vision, and visually impaired in Canada, and sometimes also around the world. We also do anti-ableism research, understanding the way that systems are created and how those systems are created in ways that are disempowering and disabling to persons with disabilities. Um, and those two pieces of research sit off of each other and play with each other a fair bit. As Chief Accessibility Officer for CNIB, I also have remit for organizational culture around accessibility and inclusion for CNIB as an employer. And so I can sort of speak to the employer perspective as well. For those who can't see me, I am a brown-skinned cisgender male with salt and pepper hair, I think is the way I would describe it these days. You won't be able to see that I'm losing it because my front profile still shows that I have hair. I have very thick glasses on. I am currently wearing a white shirt and a blue tie.
Great. Thank you so much, Mahadio. I appreciate the wonderful introduction. So, as you can tell, everyone, we have an incredibly diverse group of panelists here who bring expertise in various arenas of this particular topic. So, we're so excited to get started today. So, I'm going to start with the first portion of our question section of this incredible panel. The question I'd like to ask our panelists today, the first one is, we'd love to hear your story. So how did you get involved in disability activism? What motivated you to pursue a career in this topic? Chloe, because I can see your screen first, would you mind answering this question? We'd love to hear from you.
So I'll be honest, I was pretty reluctant in terms of when I first started out in my career. I was young and getting my doctorate, and I just presumed that I would be taking at face value for with my degree, and I really sort of felt that my intelligence and capacities were going to rule the day, that it had no impact. And it's interesting in my own work when I'm doing research with participants in other countries, often young people who are coming into the job market feel much the same way, that they don't overly identify as being disabled. But it's one of those things that gradually, I'm trained as a political scientist and a legal theorist, and those things, it began to become apparent to me that through my lived experience and talking to others, and that in fact, my disability status had a major role to play in my understanding of my own work, as well as my understanding of human rights around me and how people interacted in the environment. And so that's ultimately, I kind of leaned in. I was always interested in vulnerable identities, and I realized that in a sense it was a gift to me to be able to, my illness is one in which I experience extreme sort of ways of behaving. So sometimes I'm a total quadriplegic and require ventilator support, and other times I pass as normal. And that, rather than seeing it as an impediment, I began to see it as a way of having multiple perspectives on the world.
Thanks, Chloe. That's amazing. And I do think it's interesting how you're operating in both worlds, that at times your disability is visible, but other times you're passing. And that is a gift because you're able to kind of operate in both worlds and use that to enhance the activism that you're engaging in. So that is a very unique perspective. And I really appreciate hearing your story. Hadio, again, just by going the order by those folks that are on my screen in front of me, we'd love to hear your story and how you became involved in disability activism. What motivated you to pursue a career in this topic?
So I'm going to reject the premise of the question for a moment and say I don't consider myself actually having a career in disability activism. My primary job is not advocacy. My job is research, and my job is organizational culture, and I advocate through research and I advocate through organizational culture change. But but neither of those roles are ones that I would necessarily call out in my own personal opinion, which is mine and mine alone as disability activism per se. So I just I would just say that, you know, as somebody who has a lived experience, who was born blind and who identifies as neurodivergent, you know, I have a lot of personal experience as related to vision loss. My vision loss is situationally apparent. It's apparent when I choose to use a white cane. Um, I choose to use a white cane under specific circumstances that probably amounts to maybe 10 or 15% of the time. And so 85 to 90% of the time, if someone were observing me in action, you wouldn't be able to tell that I was a person with low vision, not unless you actually had training in ophthalmology or optometry. And so, you know, like Chloe, I think what that means is my own lived experience is situationally apparent. Um, I don't know that that's always a gift. I think it is what it is, right? It in some ways it's a choice. I could use my cane all the time. I choose not to use my cane all the time. And you know, some of that is a perception on my part that I don't need to. Um, all of that said, how did I get into disability activism? Because that was the first part of your question. So my PhD is in cancer genetics, and as I said, I have a vision impairment. I was born blind. You don't find people who are born blind in my field, um, and and that was for me the trigger, the not quite initiating an event, but more of a, you know, why aren't other people um, who live with disabilities or who are blind or low vision, why aren't they in my field? And so by asking that question, I started to grow answers through research, and I started to grow answers um, through understanding the lived experience and quality of life of persons with disabilities, first in higher education and employment, um, and then in STEM, and now in the space that I work in today. Um, and so a lot of people will say, well, you gave up science, and my answer to that is, well, no, I didn't. Um, uh, one doesn't give up science quite that way, and one needs to appreciate that I can still be a scientist even if I'm not doing the thing that I was originally taught to do. In fact, most scientists end up not doing the thing they were originally taught to do. That's almost by definition what happens in science. Um, and so getting involved in disability activism, there's the grassroots side of it. There's the policy side of it. There's the systemic advocacy side of it. There's the research side of it. And I think all of them have roles to play. Um, and everybody who does different elements of disability activism all have roles within trying to enact and effect systemic change uh, and an evolution toward anti-ableism in society. And so again, coming back to my original point, while I don't work in disability activism, I think that the work that I do is beneficial within that space.
Thank you, Mahadio. I do think it's interesting how really what motivated you to your current career is because um, you recognize that as a scientist, you didn't see folks who identified as having disabilities or those from the blind and low vision community, and so I think it's incredible how your career has progressed and that you're using uh, your background as a scientist to really explore these different issues and to kind of help with that um, the make those changes, because I think that's really very important as we move forward. So thank you so much. Maggie, I'd love to hear your story. How did you get started in this field and and pursue a career in this area?
Sure. So, like Mahadio, I would say that I don't feel that disability activism is really my primary role. Primarily, I'm doing direct service with clients, which sometimes involves advocating on their behalf. But I think I would see myself more of an advocate than an activist. But how I came to be working in employment supports for people with mental health issues, I think it was largely informed by sort of my own career journey. Like many young people, starting at university, I was very much just discovering what I wanted to do. I didn't really have a specific end goal or a career in mind, so I studied what I loved. So my undergraduate degree is in classical history with a minor in anthropology, which I loved, and it was fascinating, and I am still fascinated by it. Not a super marketable skill though. So after I graduated, I ended up working in a number of administrative positions, and it wasn't for me. It was just I'm not a big computer person, and it was just a lot of Excel. So I had also been laid off. This was shortly after the 2008 market crash in the States. And so I was laid off twice in 2 years from administrative jobs, which I wasn't loving anyways. And so I actually remember going to an employment services center because I'd heard about this program, Second Career, which everybody was very excited about, but almost nobody qualifies for. And so after hearing that I wasn't going to qualify for Second Career, I did find out that there was another program which nobody knows about called Fee Payers, which allows you to be on EI and going to school rather than looking for work. But you still need to come up with your own tuition and all of that. So fortunately, I was in a position where I was able to take advantage of that program. I come from a family of social workers and people, heavily committed to social justice topics. And so through most of my life, I had attended fundraisers with my family and, been involved in community volunteer activities and things like that. And so through those personal experiences, I'd had the opportunity to meet some wonderful mental health activists who shared their stories, and I was really fascinated by it. And mental health, as we know, doesn't discriminate, and I met people from all walks of life who had very, very different stories. And I was also very fascinated by how people can have the same diagnosis but experience that very, very differently. So it was always just a really interesting topic for me. So when I ended up going back to school and sort of deciding to reinvent my own career, I knew that I wanted employment services to be part of it because I felt I could identify with job seekers, and particularly young people who are sort of on this journey of discovery. And so I ended up studying mental health and substance use issues, and gradually transitioned to a career in employment services, and then eventually to the WIN program where I got to use my mental health background. So that's how I ended up here.
Thanks, Maggie. I appreciate you sharing your story. It is interesting how you, like I would argue many of us, including Chloe and Mahadio, we start out with one idea in our head with regards to what we're going to do with our careers, but then based on career changes, labor market changes, and also different interests that develop, or your career can go in different paths, which hopefully will lead you into something that you're passionate about, that they're very that brings you personal and professional satisfaction. So it is interesting how that journey, and how a lot of us, I would argue, have similar journeys, including my own. So thank you for sharing, Maggie. I really appreciate it. Ben, I would love to hear about your career journey in terms of how you became involved with supporting people with disabilities. I'm not going to use the word activism anymore.
Right.
I've learned my lesson, but it's interesting because from my background as a social worker, basically we learned early on that any kind of role that you have in social justice is a type of activism. So,
Right.
but I'm not going to use that word because I know not everyone sees it like that. But yes, Ben, I'd love to hear your story, how your career came to where it is now.
Thank you. So interestingly, Mahadi and Maggie both took the words out of my mouth about I wouldn't necessarily describe myself as an activist. If I am, I think I'm doing a pretty bad job in comparison to some other really amazing activists who are out there. So yeah, I appreciate the sort of reframing of that. And also, I think Maggie took a lot of the word out of my mouth in terms of the history of how I got to this place too. I also studied history as an undergraduate and also come from a long line of social workers all the way to my granddad working in Liverpool in the 60s to my mum working in Birmingham in England in the 80s, 90s and 2000s. And I actually spent a lot of time with my mum working in the kind of projects that she participated in. I got to spend summers with kids from sort of lower socioeconomic backgrounds and who probably would have identified as disabled had we had a bit better understanding back then in the 90s. I think back to it being, I was a teenager, but it felt like we were more enlightened back then, but I don't think we were. And so I grew up in a space where there was a commitment to service provision to those who came from lower socioeconomic backgrounds who, for whatever reason, couldn't participate in mainstream education. And then throughout my own sort of volunteer experience and sort of early professional experience in the UK, I either volunteered with or worked in schools who were focused on providing education in a way that met the needs of folks who identified as disabled. And then in a sort of weird flip, I decided towards the end of the 2000s that I wanted to look into international development law and human rights. So I went and did a master's in that at the University of Warwick in the UK, and was really drawn to the idea around the philosophy that underpins human rights and the problematizing of human rights as well, because especially over the years, I think we seem to think that we live in a very well protected human rights environment that's been established over decades and something that is incredibly well established and provides a strong framework both internationally but also within our own contexts. However, sort of through that, I learned that there's still a power imbalance within how human rights are contextualized. There's still a rights holder and a rights bearer, and oftentimes the rights holder cannot get rights from the bearer because of that specific power imbalance. I think we still see that a lot, even in what I would say is a very strong human rights environment within Ontario. So following up from that, I was really, and I moved here, not for work-related reasons, but for partner-related reasons. I always say that I didn't leave the UK, I was brought to Toronto. And so I was drawn to the AOD because it seemed like a really compelling example of how human rights can be enshrined, codified, and actually aspirational, rather than it being a sort of antagonistic model, which we often see in human rights cases, where one person is asserting their rights and an entity, a state, an institution is granting them. It was putting societally defined ideas of what accessibility is onto institutions and expecting them to do something ahead of time. So the promise of the AODA all those years ago was strong. I wanted to sort of work on that to see exactly how this could play up within this space. And it sort of matched pretty well with the sort of work and volunteer work I've been doing before then. I think what continues to motivate me now is that more and more, as I continue to do the work around AOD, as I continue to find ways of going over and above compliance within a complex institution, I'm noticing just how much ableism plays up across all parts and ways of life, and how it's an incredibly almost suffocating aspect of life for many folks. And later in life, I received a diagnosis around mental health related disabilities, and it sort of caused me to look back upon my life up until that point to see there were points where I felt like I was the problem within specific spaces, where I was the one going into a space with a specific way of doing things, with a specific set of sort of as Chloe says, traits or expectations of spaces, and wasn't necessarily getting that reciprocity from that space, but it was always something I placed upon me as being the issue in that environment. But I sort of, as more and more I sort of see now how ableism can play up within those spaces, I realized it wasn't me, and I think how could that affect someone as well who is trying to access services within institutions, how it's someone who's trying to access employment within the university where I work. And so the idea of ableism and how it plays up, and I take from Talila Lewis's definition of ableism a lot, which ends with you don't have to be disabled to experience ableism. And I think that shows us that everyone is impacted by the expectations of ableism to a certain degree. We're expected to perform, behave, produce in specific ways that don't always meet actually what humans are and who humans are. But that idea really motivates me to see that we can use the idea of anti-ableism that's been talked about and disability justice to actually create a more fairer and just place for everyone. And that is a hard and lofty goal, but it's why one that motivates me. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. I think you brought up some really incredible points as you talked about the trajectory of your career, particularly in human rights, and the comment that you made about ableism doesn't necessarily have to doesn't affect just those who identify as having a disability or disabilities. It can affect everyone, and I think that's super insight. That's very insightful, and I think if folks recognize that, then everyone, even those who don't identify as having a disability or disabilities, will work to try to have more inclusive work environments, because it will really doing so impacts all of us in trying to have a more just and fair and equitable work environments, and as we navigate the world. On that note, as I think about human rights, the next question I'd like to ask is, if it's clear that a worker has been experienced ableism during the job seeking process or while at work, and I know it's tricky because it's an area where it's very challenging to prove, because oftentimes employers will come up with something else in terms of why they have not hired a person who is identified as having a disability or disabilities, or someone, or maybe that, if a worker has decided to terminate someone who identifies as having a disability or disabilities, they may blame it on something else. But if it's clear that this is what they've experienced, what would you suggest? What are some options? I know all of you are involved in different areas of this particular topic. Mahadio, would you be able to provide some insight on this, or what would you do if someone came to you and said, "This is what happened to me. What should I do?"
So let me tell you a story. Let's assume you're a person with a disability, and let's make this a relatively straightforward kind of thought experiment. So you're a person with vision loss. You're coming to a job interview. You got there on public transit. You show up using your white cane or your guide dog. You did not self-identify beforehand, and so what gets noticed is that you've come into the interview with your cane or your dog, and all of a sudden the conversations with the interview committee actually have nothing to do with the job that you're coming there to interview about. The conversations with the interview committee have everything to do with, how did you get here today? How do you travel? How are you mobile in your community? Can you tell me about that? And those are questions that you're really confident in answering, because you know how you get around. So you're like, oh yeah, I'm gonna ace this. I got this interview. It's wonderful. And you're answering all the questions around how you're able to be mobile and how you get around and how you use audible stop announcements on buses and trains and streetcars to get from point A to point B, and how you use Blind Square in order to navigate when you're in various settings, and how you use Soundscape and how you use Seeing AI to get around while you're outside. It's just fantastic. It's perfect. You'd never get called back. And so here's the problem. The problem is that you weren't interviewed for the job, right? You were interviewed for how well you could get around, not for the job. And the thing is that what's just happened is a very ableist practice where somebody's sort of like, okay, I don't really know what to do here. They showed up, they have a cane, they have a dog. I don't want to hire them because that's just going to be nonsense in the workplace, right? No, I want no part of a golden retriever shedding everywhere, right? And or I don't want a dog on the premises, or the dog will be so distracting because everybody will want to pet the dog, despite the fact that a working dog in harness is not supposed to be petted. And you know, the HR person may not even know that part. And so what goes on is a scenario where the hiring committee completely throws everything they know about human resources out the window. And what ends up happening instead is this conversation about a thing that has nothing to do necessarily with can you do the job, and everything to do with can you get around. Again, you think this is great because you know how to answer all those questions, but in practice, they have nothing to evaluate you on the matrix that they're supposed to evaluate you on because they didn't ask any of the questions, right? And so that's a really good example of ableism in a very insidious way, because it's ableism that's disguised in this sort of genuine curiosity about how you live your life, and could even be asked in very diplomatic ways. How do you deal with something like that? So in that particular scenario, if that happens and you recognize that it's happening to you, the issue is, can you recognize in the moment that you are experiencing an ableist attitude, an ableist practice, an ableist behavior? If you can recognize it in the moment and take this hypothetical person in the job interview, then if I were that person, what I would say is, you know what, this is great. I got here on the bus. I'm sure you have many people who can get here on the bus. Can we please talk about the job? I'm done talking. Sorry.
Thanks,
I-
Mahadio.
I-
Please,
I address-
please.
So one of the things I think that's very particular about Canada is the human rights commissions. And the notion is that they're not there to be punitive, they're there for education. And so we are actually all strung out along the US border, in which we're inundated with the idea of we're going to sue, right? There's a sense that you can get justice. And that's not actually what the human rights commissions are about. And so your recourse actually is someone who might be been wronged or you feel that has been ableist is you have to decide whether you're going to take something to the commission. And actually, if you look at the stats, I believe I looked at a couple of years ago, is the majority of actually cases around disability. So your choices are somewhat limited. I've actually, for other reasons, been part of human rights commission cases and have won them in principle. And what they required was the individual who did the wrong in terms of rights was put through an education program. One of them chose to leave their profession, and I think our group got a nominal sum of $1,000. Now, I have no problem with that because it is about education. It's about transforming people. It's not about retribution and revenge. But I think Mahadio's approach is one in which you learn from it. You learn about how you, as an interviewee, try and not take control of the interview process, but actually guide it so that there is going to be curiosity. It's innate. It's human nature. What is that for? How does the white cane work? Fine. We can talk about that on another occasion. The point is, let's talk about the job. And you may be wondering how I actually, for instance, in my study, I met a great many visually impaired code IT people. I had no idea how that was done, really. And those individuals very clearly explained how that's done with, voice technology and what they need and what they don't need and how flexible they are. And it's really about, from my experience in my research, is that the individual answers the curiosity of the person who is interviewing them in some way about the job. You are not going to be able on your own, I don't think, combat an ableist society. You can in little ways like this, but you're not going to be able to take it on as a suit and think that you're going to win. And there are also other costs. As someone who teaches these things about law, is legal case is one in which you're invested emotionally, and there's a lot to take on. So these are all sorts of things you have to consider. Or do you take? I'm not saying you shouldn't. I'm just saying there are a lot of considerations that you need to sort of identify and then decide what you're going to do about it. But if you think that you're going to be able to sue somebody or get them back, I would think the likelihood is pretty small.
Thanks, Chloe. Ben, I know, did you have anything you want to add to this conversation?
I was going to say something in a specific direction, but I actually think that like Chloe's point makes it slightly better, because we do exist in a framework where the Human Rights Code exists and you can go to the tribunal, but the tribunal is incredibly backlogged. It's going to take 2, 3, potentially even longer years to get that kind of thing settled. And so the only way that it could really work is in thinking through how to I can only think of the term arm oneself, but I don't like that because it's sort of a violent proposition. But how you can sort of learn exactly what exists in the framework within Ontario. So I often refer back to the policy on ableism that was developed by the Ontario Human Rights Commission, which is incredibly rich with information on what someone's rights are, what the responsibilities are of organizations. And that can be a tool to use in order to use the language of what is in that policy to help engage in dialogue. I think I was thinking of sort of in terms of Mahadio's example, that's a really great example. I think I was thinking of situations where you're in a situation where you no longer have got the job, or you're in a situation where you've lost something because of the fact that you've experienced ableism or disableism, especially in the interview process. I think in terms of work, which is also part of the question, to me, that really depends on from whom and in what context you've experienced it, because again, I mentioned it before in my introduction, but there are going to be power imbalances at play when something like that takes place, especially if it's someone who is more senior than you are, someone who can make decisions. And notwithstanding all of the protections that we just talked about, there's still the potential for it to not be a positive experience. And because I think institutions, to some extent, know that there's a backlog and know that oftentimes things can be dealt with internally in a way that works for them. Having said that, I think the University of Toronto has pretty robust processes and policies in place. So I think it's definitely to think about exactly what the context is in and who around you has indicated support for you, whether they're a colleague, a co-worker, or someone that you have engaged with on a sort of more substantial level that you can discuss this with, to see that and almost share the situation with, to talk it through to determine what would be an appropriate way of doing it. And I think honestly it does depend on that context, and also thinking specifically about what organizational policies exist within your space. Like large organizations have policies everywhere that you can talk to and refer to, but smaller organizations don't have those kind of policies, so oftentimes it can be difficult in those spaces. I'm not too sure I've added too much to that, but I think that the context in which the issue takes place is very key, and I'm really just getting across the idea of power imbalance is still very much a thing within these kinds of situations, and being careful and mindful of that.
Thanks, Ben. Maggie, would you like to add anything to this incredible conversation that we're having?
Thank you, I would. And this is a question that I get asked all the time from job seekers, as either something has happened to them in the past, or they're sort of anticipating, well, what if this happens in the job interview, right? So there's a couple of things that we always advise our job seekers. And the big one is we encourage them to think to themselves, if they're asked something in an interview that seems inappropriate, or is blatantly illegal, right? If they're asked something, for example, as a young woman who was interviewing with an engagement ring on my finger, I was once asked if I was planning on having children anytime soon. Right? So there's countless examples of this kind of thing happening. And so what I always say to my job seekers is, you got to think to yourself, what's behind the question? Because I do believe that the majority of the time, employers are asking these questions from a place of genuine curiosity, right? and don't have any intention of malice or to be discriminatory in any way. But if you've never spoken to somebody who has vision impairment and who uses a seeing eye dog, somebody all of a sudden coming in and sitting in your office with a seeing eye dog, you're likely going to naturally have some questions. So I encourage my job seekers to ask themselves what's behind the question. So for example, when I was asked whether or not I planned on having children, what I said was, if you're concerned that I'm going to be taking, an extended leave of absence anytime soon, I can tell you that I have no plans in the next couple of years to be absent from work for an extended period of time. And they picked up on that right away. They kind of got the hint. And I had addressed their concern, but I had also not sort of bent to the point of discussing my personal life. And that's what I always encourage job seekers to do is, so for example, in the case that Mahadio was speaking about, where, you're asked questions about your disability and how you get around, I would echo what Chloe said about, trying to answer the questions and satisfy that curiosity, but sort of steer the conversation and bring it back around to, so well, the buses have audible stops called out, but if you're wondering how I can do graphic design, or if you're wondering how I can do something that pertains to the job, and then go on to explain how that is. And it does leave the onus on the job seeker or on the person with a disability. But another thing that we talk about a lot in the WIN program is the idea of radical acceptance, right? And this assumption of fairness, right, is often just not realistic. Like, life isn't fair, and it's not just unfair for people with disabilities. It's unfair to working moms. It's unfair to women. It's unfair to visible minorities. It's unfair to a lot of different groups. And so I think that in terms of what's in the best interest of the job seeker, is to be assertive as they feel comfortable being. And so we talk a lot about, accepting the fact that there is going to be some unfairness, and that, yes, you will bear some burden for being the one to educate potential employers about your disability. But at the same time, learning to be assertive about it really puts you in a strong position to advocate for yourself. And if you're able to teach your interviewer something, and relate things back to the job, you will have left the interview with them having learned something from you already, and so that may, as they reflect on everyone they've interviewed, they may have positive rememberings of that, and say, oh yeah, that was the person who came in, and you will be memorable as they're struggling to think about keep all these people straight that maybe they've seen over the last couple of days.
And it's Mahadio. Can I interject something?
Please. Yes.
Two things. Anybody who's ever tried to file a complaint on the Uber app will understand that every system, first of all, every system is designed to self-propagate. Second of all, every system that purports to give you the opportunity to ask for help is a system where the end user isn't the person asking for help, it's the person receiving the help request. Which means that the ease of the system isn't being built for us. It's actually being built for the people that we're supposed to talk to. And the last thing that the people that we're supposed to talk to actually want to do is to get a complaint. So I'm just going to park that there because it's provocative, and let my fellow panelists respond to it. The other thing that I want to say, and it's in direct response to what Maggie just said, nobody would dream of asking me, even if I were to wear an engagement or a wedding ring and my wife and I actually never exchanged rings. And we didn't have a reason for that aside from the fact that we got married in a hurry and we didn't have the time to buy a ring. Um, but we've chosen to keep it that way for the last 5 years. But if I were to wear a wedding ring to a job interview, nobody would dream of asking me, when am I having kids? Right? And and if I don't take a cane into a job interview, nobody would dream of asking me, how did you get here? Right? And so the problem is that, I mean, I take Maggie's point, and I think it's a reasonable way of tackling the scenario that I presented, or that can happen. But it also just says it's okay to get a discriminatory question, right? And yes, people are genuinely curious. And yes, there's a way to acknowledge respectfully the genuine curiosity while at the same time shutting it down and moving on to the thing that we're actually supposed to be here to talk about. But I will tell you, from my personal perspective and also from my professional perspective, we should not indulge that curiosity.
If I could clarify, I think I'm not saying that it's okay that it is that a discriminatory question is asked. What I'm saying is it's realistic. It's something that is likely going to happen, and I'm not saying that's the way it should be, or I'm not excusing it in any way. But from my perspective of, again, providing direct service recovery and not working as an advocate, but as somebody supporting an individual, right? My perspective on it is, what is, if this individual wants this job and wants this opportunity, right? How is the best way that, they can present themselves in an interview and and interact with that employer who may be asking these unfair questions, but calling the employer out in an interview and saying that, you can't ask me that, that's illegal or that's inappropriate, is probably not going to paint them in the best light in the eyes of the employer, right? It's likely not going to get them the job. And then they're in the situation of, well, what recourse do I have? Because as we know, the employer will make up some other reason why they weren't selected for the position. So I think that there's a difference between saying that it's okay and this idea of radical acceptance, of accepting the things that we can't change. Because as an individual job seeker, I don't believe that one person needs to own the responsibility of sort of um, advocating for all people who might be asked these questions. I think that at the level of individual service provision, it's about encouraging them to do, to the point that they feel comfortable, obviously, but what is going to be in their own best interest. And so, when we talk about radical acceptance, we're not condoning it. We're not saying that it's okay. It's just purely accepting the things that are outside of our control. And I think that part of the reality in the current labor market is that job seekers with disabilities are going to be asked inappropriate questions, or they're going to be asked questions that maybe aren't entirely inappropriate or not as far as being illegal, but are still not quite on point, right? And may get questions that all of the other people who came in to interview for the same position were not asked, right? And that's reality. And so I think that part of my job as a direct service provider is to help prepare people for that reality. But by no means am I saying it's okay that it happens.
And just to rebut that for a moment, and I'm not picking a fight with you, Maggie. I want you to understand that. I will tell you a story. In 2013, I was interviewed for a job, and at that point in time, I was deeply embedded within the University of Toronto space, and Ben's former boss, and Ben actually gave me advice on how to actually tackle that particular job interview. And it was great advice, and I followed the advice. Two things happened, which I don't think I ever told Ben about. And the one thing that I will actually share with the group is it was clear to me that the chair of the hiring committee had actually looked me up. And it was crystal clear because she had to know what I looked like in order to pick me up from the airport. And if you look me up, you find all sorts of things about me that actually disclose my relationship to disability and accessibility, and so you will know things about me that I don't have to tell you because it's a matter of the Google record. And so at the close of the interview, she drove me past every car dealership in the city that interview was taking place in, and asked me what did I like to drive, which is a very inappropriate question. And Ben, I don't think I ever told you this story. And it was a very inappropriate question. It was a very uncomfortable question, right? And I'm sitting in the car. I'm literally hostage, sitting in her front seat. She's driving me to the airport. There's nothing I can do but answer the question, right? And so I backed away from answering the question. I said, it doesn't matter to me. As long as it's got 4 wheels and it can survive snow, I'm happy, right? Which was my way of giving a non-answer to the question, because I didn't feel like I wanted to engage and say, look, I don't drive a car, right? Which would have led to all sorts of follow-up questions about, well, why don't you drive a car? Because again, that's human curiosity, and again, those are borderline inappropriate questions, and it wouldn't do me any good to call that out in that moment in time on the way to the airport, right? But I will tell you that at that moment, as much as I wanted that job previously, I reevaluated whether or not I wanted this person as a colleague. Because I can do that. I have a choice about whether I want to work in a work environment that actually allows and projects that kind of behavior. And yes, many work environments do. And so because I have a choice, I might be excluding myself from every job imaginable, right? Which would be a natural rebuttal to what I'm about to say. But recognizing that if they're going to do this in a hiring interview, they will do this in the job, right? And if it's uncomfortable in one place and it makes you squirm and it makes you want to have 3 showers when you come out, you're allowed to say, I don't want to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, job seekers always have the choice to refuse a job offer, right? I mean, of course, and often when we go through an interview process, we have the opportunity to learn more about the company or the organization that we're applying for as well. And when we learn more information about it, we may or may not still be interested. And part of that, I think, is definitely sort of assessing the work environment and assessing the work culture and seeing what kind of clues you can get about those things from the people that you meet when you go into the office or when you interview with the panel. So yeah,
Can I
absolutely.
move this forward a little bit around this, because I think what we're talking about is what ought to be and what is, and that's always a difficulty in a rights-bearing environment, is that you have theoretical rights, whether you actually experience them as something else, and whether you can act with them. And I think that's true for people with all different sort of identities. But from the work I've done in interviewing people, in 5 different countries about how they navigate interviews, it was not uncommon for them to say that they had done 75 interviews, not 75 applications, but 75 interviews. So this interview question is sort of a key thing. And what it becomes apparent, all of the people we spoke to had educational levels that surpassed their national averages. Most of them were overqualified for their jobs. So it wasn't about their CV. It wasn't about, probably their performance in the interview. It was likely this very scenario of what do you say, who's being asked what. And part of me says if we had perfect, environments, we would ask anybody, how can I make this job more successful for you? Do you have an elderly mother you have to leave every Friday to go and see it, or at her retirement residence? Do you have a handicapped brother? Are you in the middle of a divorce? These are illegal questions. You're not going to answer them. But if truly we could have a work environment in which we wanted our people who worked around us to be as practical as possible, we try to attend to those traits and flex and try and make that happen so that they work best. But the point is, most people with disabilities have very precarious work. And so it's always this walk of what is realistic and what is actually happening. And I think really your discussion between Mahadio and yourself is exactly that. What will you live with and what you can't live with? And that experience, it's not just this country, it's every country that I interviewed has this issue. I'll shut up.
No, please. I really appreciate this lively discussion, and I think that what was brought up is just is so vital to this topic, because it is a matter of like trying to decide what you feel comfortable with, and having to make these challenging decisions, which in an ideal world, it wouldn't be like that, right? Like that's what we're working for, that people who identify as having a disability or disabilities don't have to decide whether they're going to go with, answering these questions for people with interviewers who have them regarding, you know, their disabilities, or diffusing it and maybe saying outright this is inappropriate. I mean, to me it's unfortunate that this is even an issue, but this is our reality. But I think what this conversation does is it brings up you know a way of informing people that you have options. There are different ways to navigate these challenging situations. And what, in my experience working in employment services, supporting people from various equity deserving groups, is that, you do what feels comfortable for you, but these are your options, and I might say, yes, you should say, no, this is wrong, but other people, because they have, they really, they have a financial need, and they're willing to kind of go along with it, and they're okay with that, they they're fine with not saying anything. And it's tricky because everyone's different, right? um but again, I think it's unfortunate that this is even an issue, right? That people who identify as a person with a disability or disabilities even have to think of this, because other folks who may have other folks who I don't identify as part of as having a disability or disabilities, this is not something they even have to concern themselves with, at least during the
And
interview, right? Yes, please, please, please. Yes, Mahadio.
sorry, so I think the crux of the issue is that when during a job interview, somebody with an apparent disability or somebody who has disclosed, irrespective of whether they have an apparent disability or not, gets asked a question, and the question is whatever the question is. The question is potentially uncomfortable. Let's just call it uncomfortable, right? Um, how we respond is a heat of the moment decision, right? And how we think about this and how we're taught about this and how we deal with this is very much it is personal, right? Everyone's going to do it differently, and all the employment services people out there are going to prep us in certain ways. But at the end of the day, it will come down to our ability to read that room, right? And to get a sense, is this uncomfortable? Do I feel awkward? Or, in my particular case, do I feel like I need to go find a shower at the airport, right? And have one, right? And then it's okay, how do I want to respond to this? Because this is for myself a clue as to what the rest of the environment is going to be like. Because when we go for interviews, what I tell mentees all the time is you're allowed to interview your interviewers. It's not just about can you do the job, it's would you want to do the job with them, right? Or in that workplace, because we're allowed to do that. That's legitimate behavior, right? And to some degree, it's expected that in a job interview we go and we do that level of homework, right? But then the problem comes when the questions arise, and the questions arise in a space and in a manner that completely flusters us, because that too absolutely happens, right? And I think at the end of the day, we can talk about how to manage it rationally, and all of that flies out the window, metaphorically speaking, when somebody asks you an awkward question in the heat of the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. When you're caught in that situation, you're nervous. You it's a very, I mean, interviews can be some of the most stressful situations that people can experience in their professional career. And it really does depend on what you feel comfortable and what you're feeling in that moment. And Mahadio, I really appreciate what you suggested, what you suggest to, I guess, people that you're mentoring. And it's similar to what I've said to people who are getting ready for those interviews, is that it's not just about you being interviewed by them. You are interviewing them. Like you said, is this an environment that that I'd like to work in, that I feel comfortable in? And even having that mindset is empowering for people and makes them feel more comfortable in the interview, so that way they can more effectively answer the questions, and which ultimately will help them get the job. So I really appreciate that, and I love this
There
engaging
is
discussion. Yes, please.
there is one other thing I would
Please.
say.
Yes.
If you choose to disclose in the job interview, you have taken step 1 in a 3-step duty to accommodate process, preemptively assuming you get the job. And what you've done is you've executed something called the duty to inform, which means you will not necessarily have used these words, but you will say to your employer to be, your potential employer, you know, I have a functional need, and I'm asking that you think about providing accessibility supports. I loathe the word accommodations. I will not use it. So that's the last time you'll hear me say it. You know, you're basically saying to the potential employer, you will need to provide accessibility supports for me. When you've done that, you've legitimized what the employer does next. And what the employer will do next is ask all of the inappropriate questions that we were just talking about, except now that they will have a legal recourse for the asking of those questions. And at that point, if we find them inappropriate or uncomfortable and we decline to answer, the employer will have a legal recourse to say, well, I can't provide accessibility supports for you because I don't have enough information. Right. And so there's a difference between showing up with your white cane or with an ASL interpreter or with a guide dog or in some way identifying as a person with a disability without having said I'm a person with a disability. Because then if the employer's curiosity gets the better of them and they ask a question, as Maggie illustrates, you have a choice as to whether or not you should answer the question. The problem is the moment you answer the question, you've legitimized the rest of the process, right? And retroactively legitimize them asking the question in the first place, which is why I say to people, you want to think very carefully about answering that question, because once you answer the question, and so how do you get to work, as in the example that I used, you know, I take the bus and I use audio announcements and I use Soundscape and Seeing AI. Okay, so what I've just done is I've given you permission to ask me all the other awkward questions, right? And I can't stop you. And so now I have to go along with you. And often in the disclosure space, we will say, and Maggie can disagree with me on this, but in the spaces that I operate, we will say, you know, do you want to make the conversation ability first? You want to take control of the conversation and put your ability at the forefront and set that expectation. It's about your ability. And that's fine. The way that a lot of people will do that actually cedes control of the conversation to the employer. And you've triggered that duty to inform, duty to inquire, duty to accommodate legal process, right? That now we're not prepared to deal with, right? So I think there's a certain consequence, right? That often we don't think through and we're not fully cognizant of, that will catch us off guard. And then we have no recourse. We have to go through the process, no matter how squirrely it makes us feel.
That's a great point, Mahadio. Thank you for adding that, you know, how you respond to that very first question. If it's discriminatory based on your disability or disabilities, if you answer that question, you're giving legitimacy to continue in that manner. So thank you. I'd like to bring it to take it to the floor now. So if anyone has any questions for our wonderful panelists, I mentioned in the chat that Ben had to step out. He really enjoyed being here, but he had to leave because of professional obligations. But I'd love to hear from everyone else as we listen to this very engaging conversation that we've been having this afternoon. What are some questions that you have for our incredible panelists today? We'd love to hear from you.
And as Mahadio, before people ask questions, I will actually have to leave to get to the train station in like 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Mahadio. So if anyone has any questions, please do type them in the chat. And if we don't get any questions, or if people are slow to ask them, that's perfectly fine. But I do have a question that I hope, and I know Mahadio, you have to leave in 5 minutes. It would be really great if I could get some feedback from all of you. What gives you all hope or inspires you in terms of today's conversations around disabilities as compared to 5 years ago, for example? Would anyone like to answer this question, or who would like to answer this?
I'll
I-
try.
yeah.
Go ahead,
ahead,
Mahadio, if you
no,
want.
no,
No,
go
go
ahead.
ahead. You have to go. No, go ahead.
Okay.
You have to go.
So two things. One thing is I chair the Federal Employment Technical Committee for Accessibility Standards Canada. So I know what those standards look like. They're out for public review right now. And if folks haven't already seen them and commented on them, I think absolutely you should go and see them and comment on them. What gives me hope is that those standards are written from a fundamentally different premise than ask for accommodations. The other thing that gives me hope is that employers are starting to recognize the importance of workplaces that are accessible by design, as opposed to workplaces where I always have to ask for accessibility supports, right? Those are the two things that give me hope, because the current system we have, yes, it's the current system and we have to live within it, but it's crap. It doesn't work.
Great. Thank you so much, Mahadio.
So-
Chloe? Yes, please.
I think the thing is that there are more discussions like this. I think one of the central things that during my study that surprised me was, look, employment equity and human rights law exists in all the countries that I reviewed, and France was the only one that actually enforced their laws. They did an annual audit. They have a quota system. I don't know how well it will work, but when I spoke to employers, the discussions were very, very different than what I experienced in any other country, including the US that has the ADA, and including Canada, which has the Charter of Rights and human rights legislation in each province, as well as the Accessibility Act. So a lot of it was lip service. France is one guy. Most people play the fine; they don't meet the quota. But as one employer said, I think about it every year now. Like I have to think about it. At a more positive end, there were some very high level VPs in large multinational French companies who actually discovered that disabled employees were actually very good, and they saw them as the future of their workforce. That if they were more open to accommodating people, that they were going to benefit. And they saw the biggest hurdle, and this is that goes back to the interview question, is not the people with disabilities, but actually the able-bodied people, all of us who are imbued. I'm imbued with ableism surrounding them, and that changes have to take place with regard to attitudes, rather than seeing, changing the environment, adapt, and making an environment that's more universally designed, having procurement policies that are universally designed actually benefit everyone. They're not just a burden that we all have to carry. I guess for the disabled people, we will do that. Like there's a different attitude that was in place. And I think if we can move away from that sense of, oh, it's one more thing that I have to do, it's why I'm not going to do it, I want to escape this if I'm an employer, is rather seeing that we are missing out on incredible skills of people by not letting them into the workplace and into the workforce. And I'm hoping we're getting there.
Thanks, Chloe. And I'm thinking, especially since we have we have a shortage of skilled workers right now. I think employers need to rethink their hiring practices and making their I guess being more flexible with regards to requirements of specific jobs and their and environments, but also, something I thought of as you're speaking is, like you were saying, like the attitudes of the employees themselves. And I mean, it'd be great if we could be like France in so many ways, but they could potentially enforce some kind of
But
punitive.
they have no physical environment access, so that's another huge issue. But I'm just saying, at least there was an attitudinal change there. But yeah,
Which is huge. That's interesting. And I think it must be so many old kind of structures there. Mahadio, did you need to step out?
I do need to step out, but I do want to just leave a parting comment that answers a couple of questions in the chat in
Yes.
part, and then leave it to Maggie and Chloe. And that is, we don't actually need to disclose our lived experience until we need to disclose a functional need for something. And so if I don't feel that in my job, I actually need any accessibility support in the workplace, or I can manage and figure things out for myself, I don't actually have to say anything under the current rules, right? And so would I disclose in a cover letter? I've done it in the past. It's not gone anywhere. Have I disclosed in a CV? Yes. Have I disclosed because my Google profile says what it says? Yeah, inadvertently, I've done that. Have I disclosed in interviews? I have, and it's actually caused a lot of pause, right? And so have I disclosed only when I needed to? I've done that as well, right? And I think a lot of it is kind of how you have the conversation, because at the end of the day, you are in control of the conversation. You get to choose when you do it, but once you do it, there's also all these things that we were talking about before that means that you could rapidly lose control of that dialogue. And so there was a question in the chat that says, when do I disclose for maximum effect? And the answer is, you don't have to until you feel like you need accessibility supports, right? And so that could be during the interview or before. It could be after you get an offer. It's not lying, right? That's the other thing that a lot of folks will have difficulty with. It's not lying to not tell somebody, right?
I mean, that's why the privacy laws are like that. You're absolutely right.
So on that mic drop note, I'm gonna leave.
Okay. Thanks for being here, Mahadio. It's always fun to hear you. So
Chloe and I have done this before, and we've debated it back and forth a couple of times.
No,
anyway,
I always enjoy it.
So thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Mahadio. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
I will say that with that question with regard to disclosure, if you have an invisible disability, my advice is don't disclose. Sorry, just don't. If you can, I'm talking about individuals who can't mask. But really, my experience is I get in the door. I do not get in the door if I'm in a wheelchair. I get in the door, but I will not get a job. And I'm not going to tell stories out of school, but they're plain evidence to me that when I'm evidently disabled, I will not get the job. And I have the exact same CV, and I go 6 months later to the same institution and I get a job because I'm walking in and I don't have an apparent disability. So, if you can avoid disclosing, that's why the privacy law is there, so that people's attitudes don't get in the way. But I would love it that we eventually move beyond all of that bias. But right now, no. If you can avoid disclosing, you don't, because you want the job, and then you assert your rights once you have the job and you pass certain markers. I mean, I'm sorry, but that's reality, and you have to be careful as somebody who's got disabilities. And that the problem, what I see, I'm now going to mouth off, but one of the problems I see is that there's so many of us. Look, the CDC did a study in 2019 asking adults between 18 and 34 about their health status. Over 50% of them said they had a chronic illness. That means they're not a minority. Lots of people have invisible disabilities or traits. And so it's what happens is, because we don't discuss them, then someone who's not being productive doesn't talk about it because they're fearful for the job. That eventually the employer finds out, then they start negotiating about accommodations. The employer is resentful because it's now become a hullabaloo because they're not getting the productivity. It gives a bad name to the disability, whatever it may be, or to the trait. And so then employers become more reluctant. So in some ways, I see it as this false dichotomy, in which we have this privacy, but the privacy in some way means that no one's saying anything until it becomes a crisis. And then it becomes a crisis and it represents whatever disability or sickness badly. And then that employer is scared to do anything else. So I don't know. I don't know what you think, Maggie, about what I'm saying, but.
I agree with you. I think that if you don't require any, disability supports, any kind of accommodations in the workplace, then don't disclose. In terms of what the ideal time to disclose is, if you're going to do it, I always say the ideal time to disclose is after you get the job and before it begins to affect your performance. So if you require something to be able to function at your best, then you do want to disclose before you're in the position of having to go to your manager and say, I'm not meeting the quotas and this is why, or I'm not, I'm not meeting the expectations that you hired me for, and here's why. You want to disclose before it gets to that point, because it's better for building rapport, particularly if it's a new job, to say, in the past, something that's been really helpful for me is this, that, and the other thing, right? And, because I have challenges with this has worked really well for me in the past. And I'd like to apply that same thing here. It's been, it allowed me to meet all of my deadlines, et cetera, and really focus on the positive of, I'd like to do this because it's worked really well in the past. It's enabled me to be the best employee I could be. So really, you're making the argument for them to allow you to work to the best of your ability. And you're reiterating what the best of your ability is. And you're saying, I can meet all the expectations that you hired me to do. This is how I need to do it. And so if you do require accommodations and you do need to disclose, then always, I think very carefully about the timing and also who you're disclosing to, right? Because sometimes people feel a camaraderie with their coworkers and they might let something slip over the course of a shift in conversation. Before you know it, there's rumors or the management hears about it, not from you, right? And definitely you want to avoid that. And so think very carefully about who you're disclosing to also, and make sure that you're doing it in a professional way, to an appropriate person, a manager, a supervisor, HR, a union rep, perhaps, but do it with intention, right, of making your request. Always focus on the positive, reiterate the skills that you bring to the position, explain that this is something that you're asking for so that you can function at your best, and you want, emphasize that you want to be able to perform at your best, you want to do a good job, and provide whatever information they might need, but not more than they need. Right. So, for example, a lot of people that I work with have sleep issues. Sometimes it's because of their mental health symptoms. Sometimes it's because of medication they take for their mental health systems. Sometimes they just have sleep issues. But what I always say to people is, you can explain that you're requesting to have a flexible start time because you suffer from sleep apnea or insomnia or whatever. You don't have to tell them every diagnosis you have. You just, if it's about the sleep issue, focus on the sleep issue and that's it, right? You don't need to get into, well, I have, I have sleep issues because I take this medication. That's more information than they require. So I always say, start with providing as little information as possible. And if they need more and there is a process, make it clear that you're willing to cooperate and that you want to work with them collaboratively to find a solution that meets your needs and the needs of the employer. So yeah, that's my quick little rant on requesting accommodations. But I also, Matteo sort of alluded to, like, if you can manage, right? If you don't need to have that conversation because you don't require anything from them, then you don't need to disclose it all. And you absolutely don't. And a lot of people that I work with are worried that if they don't disclose now when they first get the job, what will happen down the road if they do require accommodation later. And I always say to them,
Go ahead. Sorry.
Go ahead, Chloe.
No, go ahead. I was just noticed something in the chat where someone says you're sort of in a catch-22 with a disability, because sometimes they ask you to identify as a member of a group. I just wanted to address this. It's getting on. One of the things I will say in the academy, this is my milieu of working in. Those are there all the time. Yeah, it is a double bind, because I've heard up from members high up in university organizations. I've been in administration. that they do not, despite these surveys, consider disability actually one of the minority identity groups that they want to deal with. They see it as one that anybody can declare it. It's really a wellness issue, and it's not part of, like, even though they ask for it up front. Yes, my experience is through just watching this is that it is yet to make it in the same vein as being BIPOC, gay or lesbian. They do not see it. They see it as still the highly problematic contested space, and they don't really want to take part in it. So yeah, you're right. You're in a double bind, and I'm not sure that gives you any advantage to declare that you have a disability.
Thank you. Yes, it's a tricky kind of thing to kind of to navigate, right? On the one hand, they say, yes, please disclose. We love this diversity. This is great. But then you're setting yourself up for potential discrimination, right? So, I mean, the problem is, I think that it makes companies look good, but then how many places actually live up to that, right? It's just the reality.
There's one more message. Somebody did miss my question about, they keep going to interviews and being ghosted. You're not alone. If you have an evident disability, as I said, I was talking to people in France, the UK, the US, Canada, and Belgium. And these are people who have succeeded in the workforce. It is not unreasonable that they did 75 interviews. That is not that they're interviewing badly. It's something about the culture of the interview process. And all I can say to you is be persistent. If you want a job, if you really want to work, and that was the advice I would ask every person I interviewed, what's your advice to a young job seeker, disabled job seeker? And they just said, you have to be persistent. You have to be educated. You have to speak in positive terms about whatever you're asking for in terms of accommodations, in terms of productivity. And it is kind of relentless. And I can't sugarcoat. So.
And I agree, Chloe, that it is not at all out of the ordinary for somebody to have to go on many, many interviews before, getting a job offer. And, depending on what field you're in and what sort of jobs you're applying to, because the more specialized you are, the smaller a pond you have to fish in, right? Things are posted every day for things like retail and customer service positions. But if you're a chemical engineer specializing in some subfield, there's going to be a lot fewer job postings and a lot fewer interviews as well. So if you find that you're getting interviews though, then that tells me that your resume and cover letter are great and are doing their job of getting you that interview. And the advice that I would give any job seeker for doing well in interviews, it all boils down to three things: be positive, be relevant, and be complete. Right? I feel like a lot of people get thrown by questions like, tell me about yourself, because they're so open-ended. People get thrown by questions like, well, I see that there's a gap on your resume. Can you explain that? That's a very common one that I get asked questions about. And so, sometimes people want to be very open and honest and talk about why they were off for a period of time or why there's a gap on their resume. Again, I would say just keep in mind that if you don't require any sort of accommodation, it may be a strategy worth considering to not disclose if that's an option for you. And if it's helpful to chat further, because given your particular circumstances and so on, I'm happy to connect with you afterwards and have a brief conversation about maybe what's happening and I'll try to figure out with you some next steps to try.
Thanks, Maggie.
So
if I can just, it is 1:30. I do apologize, Morton. We do have to wrap things up, and I know that we haven't been able to answer your question. So I did explain in the chat that I do appreciate the questions that everyone's asked. So what I will be doing is sharing these incredible unanswered questions to our panelists who will provide responses, and then we will post them on our website. I wish we had more time because This has just been such an engaging discussion, and it really is such an important topic. And I really appreciate everyone's participation. I just want to end on one little note as well. Like Maggie said, you shouldn't have to do this alone. If you are experiencing challenges securing employment because of your disability or disabilities, reach out to folks like Maggie, reach out to me, and seek support as needed. There are so many amazing people out there, so that way you don't have to do this on alone. It shouldn't have to be, burden of dealing with this all by yourself. It's so important to work together and have that support as we navigate the world of work, which can be so stressful and so isolating. So this sounds cliche, but help is out there. Call 1-800. I'm kidding. But really, don't hesitate to reach out to us. And on that note, I would like to thank our wonderful panelists. 2 of them are gone, but that's okay. They were fantastic while they were here. But Chloe and Maggie, thank you so much for joining us today. I was so engaged in this conversation. One of our most exciting presentations yet, or panels yet, in my opinion. And as I mentioned, this will be saved on this is being recorded, and we will be sharing this on our website shortly. So thank you, everyone. I had so much fun, and we really appreciate you coming out today. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. Bye
And I'm
now.
sorry, if I could
Yes,
just say,
please,
I'm
please.
posting in the chat some contact information.
Oh, thanks, Maggie.
Unfortunately, I am going to be off for 3 weeks as of tomorrow, but my colleague in the WIN program is Kim. She's amazing. She's an employment counselor as well, specializing in mental health. So I've left her phone number and email address there, as well as my colleague Eric Weir. He's the employment case counselor for the EAP program at Wood Green, which is an employment program for people with any type of disability. And his phone number and email address are there as well. So if you are looking for more resources and supports, there are some folks to reach out to. Thanks.
Thanks,
So,
Maggie.
and